Okay, in this one we're going to take an in-depth look at the innate immune system, looking at some of the physical and anatomical barriers that prevent us from getting infected in the first place. And then we're going to have a look at the cells that are responsible for our innate immune response, most of which produced by the myeloid stem cells that we talked about last time, but one of them, the last one, the natural killer cell, is produced by the lymphoid stem cell line. So the innate immune system consists of physical anatomical barriers that come in a variety of forms. So these physical and anatomical barriers can be the mucociliary escalator, the skin, including the sebum, which contains antimicrobial growth factors such as fatty acids and lactic acid. So it's essentially kind of the mucociliary escalator where mucus is fanned over our mucosal tissue via cilia. The pathogens get captured in the mucus and then they're transported away from the mucosal membrane where the pathogens could potentially get in, and the pathogens get moved to somewhere else where they can't cause an infection. And then the skin, the sebum on the skin, has antimicrobial growth factors which prevent replication of these pathogenic microbes. We also have the lacrimal apparatus containing lysosomes that degrade bacterial cell walls. We have the saliva, which contains lysosomes capable of breaking down bacterial cell walls again. Our gastric juice in our stomach, very acidic, so it can kill pathogens as well as digest our food. And then pathogens also get destroyed in our urine because it's very salty, so they tend not to do well unless they have a peptidoglycan membrane. Then we also have our cellular and cytokine related barriers that we're going to go over now. So the cells of the innate immune system are all derived from myeloid stem cells, so macrophages, dendritic cells, basophils, neutrophils and mast cells all come from myeloid stem cells. But the last one, natural killer cells, actually comes from the lymphoid stem cell lineage that we talked about there. So the first one, macrophages, are located in the peripheral tissues, so close to kind of the end of where these tissues are. So think the skin, they would be closer to the dermis. This means tissues away from kind of central organs or from like the center of an organ. Macrophages have pathogen recognition receptors on their cell and endosomal membranes, and when these receptors pick up antigens produced by the pathogens, it can stimulate an innate immune response. Macrophages are well equipped for a process called phagocytosis, shown here on the bottom left and here on the bottom right, where essentially the macrophage extends itself, it expands to kind of envelop and surround pathogens, encasing them in a vesicle, which is then taken inside the macrophage and gets broken down by other vesicles produced by the macrophage containing enzymes and chemicals that destroy the pathogen. As well as phagocytosis, macrophages secrete inflammatory cytokines like interleukin-1, interleukin-6, interleukin-12, TNF-alpha and interferons, which we talk about more in future videos. and these trigger inflammation at the site of infection. This inflammation at wherever the macrophage, the PRR, has picked up an antigen, by stimulating inflammation through these inflammatory cytokines, the macrophage is recruiting fluids from the lymphatic system, which is why we see swelling in inflamed areas, as well as recruiting other immune cells like neutrophils, which are going to help us fight the infection. Dendritic cells, these are very important. We're going to talk a lot about these when we go on to the adaptive immune system, but dendritic cells really function similarly to macrophages. They also have pathogen recognition receptors which stimulate an immune response. So when they detect an antigen on these pathogen recognition receptors, they excrete the same inflammatory cytokines as macrophages, so they're the same in that right, and they're both contained in the peripheral tissues. The difference is that as well as phagocytosis, dendritic cells can also do something called pinocytosis, shown here on the bottom right. Essentially, where smaller molecules get taken in when they get picked up by receptors, they get enveloped in vesicles, and then they get broken down within the cell. So it's like phagocytosis, but for smaller molecules. It's usually called cellular drinking. But the important thing about dendritic cells, they play a very important role in the adaptive immune system, as they are antigen presenting cells, so they bring antigens from the peripheral tissues to the lymphoid cells. So they bring antigens to maturing T cells in the thymus, which is this gland shown in orange here on the top right, where the T cells develop, as well as presenting antigens to B cells within the lymph nodes, and then initiating clonal expansion when the B cells who are able to pick up that antigen begin to divide to produce a lot of antibodies to fight that particular pathogen that the antigen came from. Basophils are a rare type of granulocyte, mainly found in the blood. They enter the site of infection when the endothelium becomes leaky in a process called diapedesis. They're mainly evolved in bodily defenses against helminths, shown on the bottom right, and protozoa, shown on the bottom left. If you don't know what granulocytes are, macrophages and dendritic cells also have granulocyte properties because they release cytokines. They're basically a type of immune cells that store chemicals like histamine and heparin in vesicles called granules. When these granulocytes detect a pathogen through receptors, they perform a special kind of exocytosis called degranulation, where these granules containing these inflammatory chemicals bind to the cell membrane, and then they release these chemicals into the extracellular matrix, and they travel elsewhere throughout the body. Neutrophils are important granulocytes characterized by irregularly shaped nuclei. So you can see that in this image to the bottom right here. It has about 3. It looks a bit like a face. They're found in the blood, and they enter the site of infection via diapedesis, same as basophils. They're particularly effective against bacterial infections, as they're short-lived, fast reproducing, and numerous phagocytes. They're produced in large quantities in the bone marrow. It's a fact that 60% of the bone marrow activity is actually dedicated to producing these neutrophils, which is why leukemia patients being treated with chemotherapy suffer from neutropenia, because the chemo damages their bone marrow and prevents